Story 1. The hum of the Chinook was the only sound louder than the frantic thump of my own heart. Below, the emerald canopy of the Amazon stretched, unbroken, seemingly infinite. Deployment to Brazil hadn't been on anyone's radar, a sudden, clandestine mission cloaked in vague whispers of ecological research. My unit, specialized in reconnaissance and jungle warfare, knew better than to ask questions. We landed in a clearing, the humid air thick and cloying, instantly plastering our fatigues to our skin. Sergeant Miller, a granite-faced veteran with eyes that had seen too much, barked orders. Perimeter sweep, 2-man teams. Standard protocol. I paired up with Diaz, a wiry kid from Texas with a nervous laugh that grated on my nerves, especially now. The jungle swallowed us whole. Sunlight barely penetrated the dense canopy, casting the world in a perpetual twilight. Giant ferns brushed against our faces, dripping with moisture. The air hung heavy, saturated with the smell of rotting vegetation and something else, something faintly sweet and sickening. "You smell that, Sarge?" Diaz whispered, his voice tight. "Smell what?" I snapped, more to reassure myself than anything. He shrugged, his eyes darting around the encroaching greenery. "I dunno, like overripe fruit, and something else." We continued our sweep, the oppressive silence broken only by the buzzing of insects and the occasional screech of unseen birds. It was the absence of other sounds that was truly unnerving. No monkeys chattering, no rustle of small animals. Just this, stillness. A stillness that felt pregnant with something unseen. As dusk deepened, a low, rhythmic throbbing began to permeate the air. It was subtle at first, like a distant drumbeat, but it steadily grew in intensity, vibrating through the very ground beneath our boots. "What the hell is that?" Diaz stammered, his face pale in the fading light. I shook my head. "No idea." Back to base. We doubled back, the throbbing growing louder, the air thicker, the sweet, sickening smell more potent. We found the clearing empty. The Chinook was gone. Panic, cold and sharp, clawed at my throat. "Miller!" I yelled, my voice swallowed by the suffocating jungle. "Miller, where are you?" Only the throbbing answered. We stumbled through the undergrowth, calling out for our unit, our voices thin and reedy against the growing darkness. We found their discarded equipment, packs ripped open, rifles lying on the ground, canteens crushed. No bodies. Diaz whimpered, sinking to his knees. "They're gone, just gone." The throbbing intensified, morphing into a pulsating wave of sound that seemed to press against our skulls. The ground began to tremble. Then, we saw it. Through the dense foliage, a pulsating, bioluminescent glow emanated from the heart of the jungle. It pulsed in time with the throbbing sound, casting grotesque, shifting shadows that danced on the surrounding trees. The sweet, sickening smell now overwhelmed us, causing our stomachs to churn. Terror, pure and primal, seized us. We ran. We ran blindly through the jungle, the pulsating light growing closer, the throbbing sound echoing in our skulls. We tripped, fell, scrambled to our feet, driven by an instinctual fear older than humanity itself. We stumbled into a small ravine, hidden beneath a tangle of vines. We huddled there, chests heaving, trying to control our ragged breaths. The pulsating light washed over the ravine, illuminating the slick, mossy walls. The sweet, sickening smell was overpowering. Suddenly, Diaz screamed. He pointed a trembling finger at the ravine wall. Embedded in the moss, pulsating faintly, were dozens of things. They resembled large, iridescent cocoons, their surfaces slick and glistening. They pulsed in time with the throbbing light, the sweet smell emanating from them. One of the cocoons began to split. The pulsating light pursued us, the throbbing sound echoing in our ears, the sweet, sickening smell filling our lungs. We ran until dawn, until the throbbing faded, until the light receded, until the smell became a faint, lingering memory. We found a river and followed it, eventually stumbling upon a small village. The villagers, their faces etched with ancient wisdom and a deep-seated fear, took us in. They didn't speak our language, but their eyes told us everything we needed to know. They knew what we had seen. They knew what lived in the heart of the jungle. They gave us food and shelter, but they wouldn't look us in the eye. They avoided talking about the jungle. They treated us like the contaminated. Days turned into weeks. We tried to contact the outside world, but our radios were dead. We were stranded, isolated, lost in a world where the boundaries between reality and nightmare had blurred. One night, as I lay awake, staring at the thatched roof of the hut, I heard it again. Faint, but unmistakable. The throbbing. I sat up, heart pounding. I looked over at Diaz, who was asleep, his face pale and drawn. He murmured something in his sleep, something I couldn't understand. Then, I smelled it. Faint, but growing stronger. The sweet, sickening smell. I glanced towards the window. A faint, pulsating light flickered through the cracks in the wooden shutters. The throbbing grew louder. The light grew brighter. The smell intensified. And then, silence. I haven't seen Diaz since that night. The villagers pretend not to know what I'm talking about. They avoid my gaze. They treat me like something to be feared. The throbbing is gone, the light is gone, the smell is gone. But the fear remains. A deep, gnawing fear that something is waiting, something watching, something just beyond the edge of my vision, something waiting to return. Story 2. Story 2, The Whispering Sands. The hum of the Chinook was hypnotic, a lullaby against the backdrop of the vast, ochre expanse of the Afghan desert. We were a small recon team, 4 of us, dropped off at a desolate outpost codenamed Echo 4. Our mission, routine surveillance. The reality, another meaningless pinprick in an endless, incomprehensible war. Dust devils danced across the baked earth, their swirling forms mimicking the gnawing unease in my gut. Corporal Diaz cracked a joke about the heat, but the forced laughter died quickly in the oppressive silence. Sergeant Miller, a man whose face was etched with the weariness of too many deployments, just stared out at the horizon, his jaw tight. Private O'Connell, fresh-faced and eager, fiddled with his radio, the static hiss a counterpoint to the whispering wind. Echo 4 was a crumbling mud brick structure, more ruin than outpost. A single, rusted radio antenna pointed skyward like a skeletal finger. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of dust and decay. The silence was profound, broken only by the occasional skittering of some unseen desert creature in the rafters. The first night was uneventful. We set up a rotating watch, the hours dragging by with agonizing slowness. The desert night was a canvas of oppressive blackness, punctuated only by the cold, distant stars. It was on my watch, just before dawn, that it started. A faint whispering. At first, I dismissed it as the wind, but the wind was still. The whispering persisted, a sibilant murmur that seemed to emanate from the very walls of the outpost. It was a language I didn't recognize, a string of guttural sounds that crawled under my skin and settled in the pit of my stomach. I checked the perimeter, my heart hammering against my ribs. Nothing. The desert stretched out, empty and desolate under the pale moonlight. But the whispering continued, growing louder, closer. Hear that? O'Connell's voice was tight with apprehension. He had emerged from the outpost, drawn by the unsettling sound. It's nothing, I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. Just the wind. He shook his head. No, sir. It's something else. The whispering intensified, a chorus of voices now, swirling around us, seeming to press in from the vast emptiness of the desert. It felt like we were submerged in sound, drowning in a sea of whispers. The next day, the whispering continued, a constant, insidious presence. It gnawed at our nerves, frayed our sanity. We tried to rationalize it, the wind, hallucinations brought on by dehydration, the psychological strain of the deployment. But the explanations felt hollow, insufficient. Sergeant Miller, usually stoic, began to exhibit signs of paranoia. He started talking about shadows moving in the periphery, about eyes watching us from the dunes. Diaz became withdrawn, muttering to himself in Spanish. O'Connell, the youngest of us, was visibly terrified, his eyes wide with a primal fear. The radio, our only lifeline to the outside world, fell silent. We tried everything, different frequencies, different antennas, but nothing worked. We were alone, cut off from command, surrounded by the whispering desert. One night, Diaz snapped. He grabbed his rifle and ran outside, screaming into the darkness. We never saw him again. The desert had swallowed him whole. The whispering seemed to intensify after Diaz's disappearance. It became more focused, more personal. It felt like the voices were speaking directly to us, taunting us, mocking our helplessness. O'Connell was next. He woke up screaming one night, claiming that something was touching him, something cold and slimy. He clawed at his skin, leaving bloody tracks on his arms and chest. By morning, he was gone. Vanished. Another offering to the whispering sands. Now, it was just Sergeant Miller and me. Two men, alone in a crumbling outpost, surrounded by an endless expanse of desert, consumed by the insidious whispers. Miller had stopped talking altogether. He sat hunched in a corner, his eyes fixed on some unseen point in the distance, a low, guttural moan escaping his lips. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't eat. The whispers were constant, a relentless assault on my sanity. I began to see things, shadowy figures flitting across the dunes, distorted faces peering at me from the cracks in the walls. Then, one night, the whispering stopped. The silence was deafening. It pressed in on me, heavy and suffocating. I held my breath, waiting, dreading. Then, a new sound emerged. A scratching. It came from outside, from the wall of the outpost. Slow, deliberate, methodical. It was the sound of something trying to get in. I grabbed my rifle, my hand trembling. I moved towards the door, my heart pounding in my chest. I reached for the latch, my fingers brushing against the cold metal. I hesitated. What was out there? What had happened to Diaz? To O'Connell? To Sergeant Miller, who now sat rocking back and forth, his eyes vacant, a thin stream of drool running down his chin? The scratching stopped. Another silence. Then, a low, guttural growl, right outside the door. It was a sound that resonated with something primal, something ancient, something terrifying. I stood there, paralyzed, my finger hovering over the latch. The growl intensified, closer now, right on the other side of the door. I could feel the vibrations in the floor. And then, the whispers started again. Louder than ever. Closer than ever. They were inside the outpost now, all around me, inside my head. I'm still here. In the outpost. The door remains unopened. The scratching continues intermittently. The growling comes and goes. The whispers never cease. I don't know what's out there. I don't know if I want to know. But I know one thing, I'm not alone. And whatever is out there, it's waiting. Story 3. Story 3, The Whispering Sands. The hum of the Chinook was a lullaby I'd grown accustomed to. Afghanistan. Deployment number 3. Dust swirled outside the grimy window, painting the landscape in shades of ochre and brown. Sergeant Miller, seated across from me, chewed gum with the rhythmic precision of a metronome. Almost there, Ramirez, he mumbled, his voice barely audible over the roar of the rotors. I nodded, trying to swallow the lump forming in my throat. This mission felt different. The air, heavy and still, pressed down on me, a tangible weight. We landed near a small, deserted village nestled amidst towering sand dunes. The heat slapped me in the face as I stepped off the chopper, a wall of dry, baking air. The village, a cluster of crumbling mud brick buildings, was eerily silent. Not even the wind whispered through the empty doorways. "Reckon the perimeter," Captain Davies barked, his voice sharp and clipped. "Report back in 30. My squad fanned out, the crunch of our boots on the sand the only sound breaking the oppressive silence. The sun beat down on us, turning our uniforms into sweat-soaked shrouds. The village felt wrong. Like an empty shell, devoid of life, yet pregnant with an unspoken dread. As I rounded the corner of a dilapidated building, a low growl rumbled in the distance. I froze, scanning the horizon. Nothing. Just the endless expanse of desert. Just the wind, I muttered to myself, trying to dismiss the uneasy feeling that had settled in my gut. But the growl returned, closer this time, accompanied by a low, rhythmic thumping. The sand beneath my feet vibrated slightly. I raised my radio. "Captain, do you copy? I'm picking up something strange." Static crackled in my ear. "Ramirez, report." Davy's voice, strained with static, was barely intelligible. "Sir, I think something's out here." A low growl, and thumping. More static. Then silence. The thumping intensified, drawing closer. The ground trembled beneath my boots. The growl morphed into a guttural rasp, a sound that seemed to claw at the edges of sanity. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through me. I raised my rifle, my heart pounding against my ribs. Suddenly, the sand in front of me shifted, forming a swirling vortex. The rasping intensified, echoing from the heart of the swirling sand. A monstrous shape began to coalesce within the vortex, a grotesque silhouette against the blinding sunlight. It was immense, its form shifting and pulsating, like a mirage given flesh. I stumbled back, my rifle clutched uselessly in my hands. My mind screamed, but my voice was trapped in my throat. The creature emitted a deafening shriek, a sound that ripped through the silence of the desert, a sound that promised pain and oblivion. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, the vortex collapsed, the monstrous form vanishing with it. The silence that followed was even more terrifying than the shriek. I stood there, paralyzed by fear, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The sand still vibrated faintly beneath my feet. "Ramirez! Report!" Davy's voice crackled through my radio, breaking the oppressive silence. I pressed the transmit button, my voice trembling. "Captain, something was here. It's gone now, but... God, it was... Ramirez, what did you see?" Davy's voice was urgent, laced with disbelief. I struggled to find the words, the image of the monstrous form seared into my mind. I don't know, sir. It was huge, in the sand. Ramirez, pull back to the LZ. Now! I didn't need to be told twice. I turned and ran, my boots sinking into the whispering sand. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The Chinook was waiting, its rotors churning the dust-laden air. I clambered aboard, my hands shaking. Miller looked at me, his eyes wide with concern. "What happened, Ramirez?" I shook my head, unable to speak. The image of the creature still haunted me, the rasping shriek echoing in my ears. As the Chinook lifted off, I glanced back at the village, nestled amidst the whispering sands. The setting sun cast long, eerie shadows across the desolate landscape. A low growl rumbled in the distance. We flew back in silence, the weight of the unspoken hanging heavy in the air. No one mentioned what I had seen. No one asked. But I knew, in the chilling silence, that they had heard it too. The whispering sands held a secret, a monstrous secret that lurked just beneath the surface, waiting to be unleashed. And I was left with the terrifying certainty that what I had seen was just a glimpse of the horrors that lay hidden in the heart of the desert. We had disturbed something ancient, something powerful. And I knew, with a dread that settled deep in my bones, that it would not be forgotten.